Hey guys, this is Hamza Blushi, and in this video I have compiled 51 facts about Linux, so let's get started. With the first facts. Linux was created by Linus Torvalds and was released on September 17th, 1991 while attending the University of Helsinki. Linux has been in development for 30 years as of making of this video. Linus also created Git, a version control system to manage the development of the Linux kernel. Linus made Linux because he didn't like DOS, and Apple's Mac operating system only ran on Apple hardware, and Unix was only available for universities and schools. In the beginning, Torvalds was going to name the Linux kernel as Freaks because he thought that Linux was too egotistical. Linux is pronounced Linux and not Linux.
Linus or Linus? What's your preferred pronunciation?
When I speak Swedish, it's Linus. When I speak Finnish, it's Linus. When I speak English, it's Linus. And I really don't care how people pronounce my name, but Linux is always Linux.
Linux is licensed under the GNU General Public License version 2, which is a free and open source license. It means that everyone can view, edit, and redistribute the source code. Linux is a monolithic kernel. What is a kernel, you might say? A kernel handles process control, networking, access to the peripherals and file systems, device drivers, and either integrated directly with the kernel or added as modules that are loaded while the system is running. And now let's move on to the development facts of Linux. Linux used Minix, utils, and applications in the beginning, but later they switched to the GNU utils, and that's why sometimes you hear people refer to Linux as GNU/Linux. Minix, by the way, is an operating system made by Andrew Tannenbaum, a computer science professor, and he intended Minix as a minimal Unix-like operating system targeted at students who want to learn operating system principles. Linux was initially developed for the desktop computers and the x86 architecture, but now it supports almost every CPU and every architecture. Linux is a Unix-like operating system, meaning that it follows some of the Unix philosophy and principles. Linux has not had a clear design strategy from the beginning, but it evolved throughout the years to become the way it is today. There are three types of the Linux kernel. First is the mainline kernel, second is the stable kernel, third is the long-term support kernel, LTS for short, which is maintained for a long period of time. Linux development consists of the stable branch of the kernel, maintained by Greg Crow-Hartman, and Linus is the maintainer of the bleeding edge or latest kernel, which is called the Linux Next branch. Code is submitted by the Linux community or companies to the Linux development team. Linux is written largely in C, but some components are written in other languages like assembly, Python, and now Rust. A new Linux kernel is released every 2 to 3 months. Companies like Huawei, Intel, Google, Red Hat, Facebook, Canonical, and Samsung are among the top contributors to the Linux kernel development in the recent years. Debian version 4.0, which was released in 2007, this distribution contained close to 283 million source lines of code, and the study estimated that it would have required about 73,000 years and cost $8.95 billion, and that's in 2021 dollars, to develop by conventional means. As of 2021, the 8.11 release of the Linux kernel had around 30.34 million lines of code. Roughly 14% of the code is part of the core, while 60% is only for device drivers. Now we move on to Linux as the Swiss Army knife of computers. Linux has the largest install base on general purpose computers than any other operating system. Android and Chrome OS are based on Linux, meaning they use Linux as the kernel or the core. On the desktop, Linux has around 2.3% market adoption. Linux is the leading operating system in the server market, with an overwhelming 96.4% of the top 1 million web servers operating systems are running Linux. Since 2017, all of the top 500 supercomputers are running Linux. Linux can also run on embedded systems like IoT devices, because you can strip a lot of the Linux components to a base that can be very lightweight. Examples of embedded systems that can run Linux: we have routers, smart home technology like televisions, Tizen on the WebOS are an example of that. Linux is also used in automobiles like Tesla, Audi, Mercedes, Hyundai, Toyota, all rely on Linux. Linux is also used in digital recorders, video game consoles, and smartwatches. Now we move on to facts that are related to Linux distributions and applications. Every Linux distribution has a package management system of some kind, such as apt in Debian, pacman in Arch, and DNF in Fedora. Alternatively, packages can be compiled from compressed archives known as tarballs. Speaking about package managers, application stores were first introduced in Linux, then other companies copied that concept. X11 is the display server used to render graphical applications on Linux and is going to be replaced by Wayland to be the new display server. Linux has many graphical interfaces, aka shells or desktop environments. To name a few, we have KDE Plasma, GNOME, Mate, Cinnamon, LXDE, Pantheon, and XFCE. Plasma and GNOME are the most popular desktop environments on Linux. And for those who are looking for something lightweight, window managers are a very lightweight desktop environment, and they are highly customizable and mostly keyboard driven. But there's a catch, you have to configure it yourself. Many Linux distributions are geared to a specific purpose. For example, Arch Linux is geared to high customizability and latest updates. Debian, on the other hand, is designed to have high stability and reliability. Onto more specialized Linux distributions, Kali Linux is designed for digital forensics and penetration testing or hacking. Qubes OS is designed to have high level of security and privacy. Edward Snowden once said about Qubes OS, Qubes OS is the best operating system available today. It's what I use and free. And nobody does virtual machine isolation better than Qubes OS. Linux distributions bundle the Linux kernel with system software. For example, a Linux distribution can have the GNU C library, systemd, and other Unix utilities, and daemon. Ubuntu is the world's most popular Linux-based desktop operating system. According to DistroWatch, there are 276 active Linux distributions. Now to Linux in major industries. SpaceX uses Linux in their Falcon 9 rocket and their Dragon 2 capsule. Robonaut 2 is the first humanoid robot in space and is also Linux-based. Linux has been the platform of choice in the film industry. The first film produced using Linux servers was Titanic. Major studios including DreamWorks Animation, Pixar, Weta Digital, and Industrial Light and Magic all have migrated to Linux. In Japan, bullet trains use Linux to maintain and manage the Advanced Automatic Train Control System. Linux is running the New York Stock Exchange, and most banks around the world run Linux. Linux is used by many military organizations around the world. USA, UK, Russia, and others use Linux in their mission-critical applications, for example in drones, UAVs, and many more. Now we move on to fun facts about Linux. Torvalds picked a penguin called Tux as the mascot for Linux in 1996 after being bitten by an angry penguin as a kid on a visit to Canberra, Australia. Steve Jobs offered Linus Torvalds a job on the condition that he stopped development on Linux. Linus thankfully declined. 13.3% of the latest Linux kernel is made up of blank lines. Blank lines are part of the strict coding style that keeps the Linux kernel tidy, efficient, and ordered. The Linux kernel has crossed 1 million code commits on Github. Microsoft, the company behind Windows, which is a Linux competitor, they use Linux in their servers and their Azure cloud. On 15th of August 1994, William R. De La Cruz Jr. filed for the trademark Linux and then demanded royalties from Linux distributors, and after court battles, Linus Torvalds got the trademark rights back in 1997. Apple uses some of the GNU utils in their operating systems like iOS and macOS. These 51 facts about Linux were made possible by Wikipedia, GeeksforGeeks, OMGubuntu, and its FOSS. Thanks to all of them for making this possible. I hope you all enjoyed this video, and if you have any facts about Linux that I didn't mention, please mention it in the comments below. And if you like my content, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel. And if you really like my content, you can go to my Patreon page and donate there. I will be really grateful. And please share this video to anyone who's curious about Linux. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.